We screamed into space and heard the echo. Part for Hound Dog. 2532, in devastation, Titan orbit, Saturn. Harvey gritted his teeth as he fired 2 more shots into the corpse lying on top of him, just to make sure it was dead. With effort, he rolled the body off himself before it could bleed all over his stylish dark brown faux leather jacket. His other clothes he didn't care about as they were standard-issue EIC suits. Black pants and shoes with a matching tie. Not that he wore a tie with his button shirt, or did the buttons all the way to the top like the others. His jacket was specially fabricated and one of a kind. "You could have helped, Gerald," Harvey complained to his partner, and Ward, who was leaning nonchalantly against the door jamb with a grin on his stupid face. Gerald was large even for a canid, his 2-meter-tall frame having to stoop to fit into the doorway meant for humans. With a lean human body and bushy unkempt silver-black wolf tail, Gerald's muscular form barely fit his tearaway black shirt that read, "Security." The shirt matched his tearaway black pants though he wore no footwear. Harvey could not make him wear the standard combat boots because he said he could feel the world better that way. His hands were human-like but with sharp black nails that would grow back no matter how often Harvey had them filed down. To round off his attire, Gerald wore a thick metal collar that Harvey did not care to think about at the moment. But what Harvey disliked the most about Gerald was that grin that showed off his large canines on almost human face. Almost except for the fluffy silver-black wolf ears. Harvey brushed unseen dust off his own dark trousers as he stood, holstered his weapon in its place under his armpit and ran a hand through his short white-streaked hair. "You are giving me more grey hairs. You know you are supposed to do as your handler says?" Harvey reminded Gerald, but his admonition was undermined by Harvey's attention being solely on the stiff he had just killed. Which wouldn't have been worrying but for the fact that Harvey had checked the person had no pulse before he was assaulted. It was a new experience for Harvey to re-kill someone. Harvey's second inspection of the corpse did not yield any new information. Human. Male. Average build. Wearing silver thermal pajamas and a VR headset, although the pajamas now sported a twin pair of burn holes from Harvey's laser pistol. Harvey scratched his salt and pepper stubbly chin. As well-groomed as Gerald was, Harvey didn't afford himself the same luxury, especially when they were out on a job. "I knew you could handle it, boss." "Also it smelt dead," Gerald countered, though Harvey knew him well enough to know he was not being completely honest by the way Gerald's motionless tail was turned slightly between the canid's legs. Gerald was displeased with himself for not preventing the attack. Harvey didn't press it any further. A canid had to follow their handler's commands, and if they did not, the collar Gerald wore would inject a concoction to quickly and painlessly end the canid's existence. An existence that was created for jobs like this one. "Your nose doesn't lie," Harvey agreed, though his own mediocre olfactory sense couldn't detect a whiff of decomposition setting in. The dry and cool air that is common on in devastation delayed the onset of decay, so Harvey guessed it was no more than a day or two. A transparent screen, generated by Harvey's augmented reality chip, appeared with blue lettering in only Harvey's peripheral vision. "Mr. Herschel. EIC pencil pusher. No friends. One aunt on Titan, otherwise no family. Reported missing 2 days ago when he didn't arrive or call in at work." Harvey summarized. "A VR nut that played himself to death?" Gerald suggested, as he lounged against the door. Harvey began problem-solving. If he were an addict, he would have the VR implant, especially on his salary. No signs of malnourishment. Maybe a bit dehydrated, but that takes at least 3 days to be lethal. Though the autopsy will tell us more, there are no outward signs of trauma. "Except where you shot him, boss," Gerald quipped. "Nothing other than where I shot him," Harvey corrected, "and we already established he was dead before we got here. You had to break down the door which was locked from the inside so we can rule out a physical murder." "So?" the canid asked, used to being the soundboard for Harvey's thought process. Gerald was the muscle and complainer, and Harvey was the brains and feeder. That was how they worked. "So, let's assume his jumping at me was simple rigor mortis." The dark-haired investigator stooped over the corpse and pulled off its VR helmet to peer inside. He threw it over to Gerald, who deftly caught it in one large hand. "Smell that." Gerald raised it to his pointed nose and gave a deep sniff. "Burnt. It smells like something caught fire." Harvey nodded. Faulty wiring in the helmet could have caused all this. "We'll get the body baggers for Mr. Hushel and send that off to the techs to have a look." Blips on Harvey's AR indicated the orders had been sent, setting into motion what needed to be done. For now we can say it was a faulty VR helmet wiring that both killed him and made him dance the undead fandango on me. "Let's go grab a drink." "Do you think the lap dancers are out this early?" 2532, Endeavour Station, Titan Orbit, Saturn. It wasn't a faulty wire, Harvey sighed as he went down on his haunches over the second corpse lying on the floor. It had only been 2 hours since the last one was found, but at least this one didn't jump at him. Spasmic reflexes, the baggers said. What utter hogwash. Rigor mortis didn't cause bodies to jump up at you. Harvey believed it was the VR helmet, but he still was waiting for word from the techs. The garage Harvey found himself in housed the deceased's exosuit, confirming Harvey's readout, which stated their occupation as a loader. Exosuits were a frame worn over the driver's body specifically used to pick up heavy loads with large fork-like hands. It was not unusual for career loaders to own their own exosuit rather than relying on the cheap rigs supplied by EIC. The victim, Harvey had to start thinking of them as victims, was also wearing a VR helmet with that same telltale burnt smell. Just like the last one. A sniffling, half-crying could be heard from the adjoining living room where Gerald was looming unhelpfully over the victim's boyfriend, Bob. Gerald was no good at consoling the bereaved, but Harvey was no better. So he made Gerald handle it when there was no one else. He ordered counseling for Bob when he requested the body baggers and, once again, a station courier to send the VR headgear to the techs for analysis. Harvey checked his messages, specifically looking for any answers from the first victim, but there was no reply yet. At that moment a reminder alarm went off, lighting up Harvey's AR with red instead of the usual calming blue. He had been so engrossed in the case he had forgotten what the time was. With a sigh, he marched to the living room, his jacket fluttering dramatically. Harvey made it do that on purpose because it made him look incredible. Joining the group in the other room, Harvey held down a smirk at the sight of a resigned Gerald awkwardly patting Bob on the back. It was punishment for all that smirking Gerald had done earlier. Harvey wanted to rub more salt in that wound, but he had other business to attend to at that moment. He pulled out an injector pistol from his coat pocket and pressed its nozzle up against Gerald's shoulder. "Time for your vitamins," he said out loud for Bob's sake, and pulled the trigger. The jet of medicine was delivered into Gerald's muscle tissue in an instant. Both Harvey and Gerald knew these were not vitamins but a kind of medicine which kept Gerald alive and healthy. Harvey didn't know the details, nor did he care to find out, but without it Gerald's cells would rupture in cascading failure in a matter of days. The collar was the quick kill switch that only some canids wore, while its medicine was made to keep canids in check and dependent on EIC. Either way, their end was messy. Harvey had seen more than one canid go that way. It was messy and he would prefer to forget all about it. He would make sure Gerald got his medicine because he wasn't going to lose him. He wouldn't lose again. Gerald shook off the burning sensation of this medicine entering his system and growled quietly to Harvey, "You might want to hear this, boss." Gerald nodded at boyfriend Bob. "Could you repeat what you told me?" Gerald said as he continued to console Bob with his oversized hand. Now that he was closer, it was obvious that part of Bob's discomfort was Gerald. At Gerald's prodding, Bob's high-pitched words ran over each other. "When I got back, I found him convulsing on the floor and he was shouting about us not being in debt. We don't owe anyone money, so I am not sure what he meant." "What were his words exactly?" Harvey queried, his interest piqued. Bob answered hurriedly. He kept repeating, "No loan. No loan. No loan." And then he went quiet. Bob buried his head in his hands as he continued to cry. "How long ago was this?" Bob answered something unintelligible into his own hands. Harvey gestured to Gerald, who grabbed the grieving man by the back of the neck and forced his head up so that Bob was looking directly at Harvey. "I didn't quite hear that. Harvey said dangerously, "I must be getting old." "What did you say?" Harvey was getting old. Over 40 soul cycles. His hair was starting to go grey like Gerald's naturally black and silver, though the canid was still in his 20s. Harvey had stopped counting a while ago. They made a fine colour-matching pair, Harvey thought sarcastically. Bob's grief was replaced with fright as he blurted, "Hours. A few hours ago. I called you guys immediately." Harvey grunted and gestured for Gerald to let the poor man go, which he promptly did. Endeavour Station was big, with 1 million or 2 beings going about their business. With those numbers, many problems that needed investigating would arise frequently. There were more than enough investigators to handle the volume, but even so it had gotten busy recently. "Time for the dancers," he said, walking towards the door with Gerald trailing at his heels. A priority message flashed on Hardy's AR. With a grim expression he said to Gerald, "Cancel the lap dancers. We have another 2 victims." 2532, Endeavour Station, Titan Orbit, Saturn. The 3rd victim had no outward injuries and was already being collected by the baggers for further analysis. There was more than enough cause to put it on the express investigation queue, so Harvey ordered that. It was a handy way to jump ahead of the normal queue. While that was cooking, Harvey and Gerald rushed to the 4th victim's residence. "Break it down," Harvey told Gerald when they reached the door. No need to knock or check who was home. He had more than enough authority as part of the Canid Security Division to bust in as long as he got results and had good enough reason. Harvey had ample reason and he always got results. Besides, dead bodies didn't answer doors. Gerald covered his nose as the pair broke into the tiny apartment on the lower decks of Endeavour Station. These decks weren't policed as stringently as the upper floors, where the hard-working and valued EIC employees had their living quarters, even if the room sizes were very similar. It was about quality of living or something. Harvey knew the stench of death. By the smell, purification had set in, and he deduced the body must have been stewing down here for at least a week. The bloated corpse on the floor, nestled in a makeshift nest of soil duvets, confirmed his suspicions. The small stature and overly green skin marked this body, face obscured by the VR helmet it wore, as one of the other species besides humans that were common on the station. "Goblin," Gerald growled, still clutching his nose. "This one is really dead, boss. Can I stand outside?" Yes, Harvey waved him off, pulling a face as a waft of purification gusted into his nostrils. "Go stand guard at the door, and if you see any other goblins, grab them. They usually work in malignance." Harvey had worked around goblins enough to know the name for a collection of goblins was a malignant. He had no idea who came up with it, but there it was. Although, this one might have been alone. Harvey noted out loud, seeing as there were no other bed nests and only tools enough for one engineer. Even those were minimal. He almost changed his mind when he picked up an electronic photo display, called an ink deck, that showed a pair of humans, old and young, posing with a young grinning goblin. The device looked old, and after fiddling with it, found it to be broken, stuck on that one image. He returned the square of electronics where he found it. Harvey didn't want to touch the literally stinking goblin, but he needed facial recognition to identify the creature, and he needed it done quickly. Goblins could also be identified by their tattoos and piercings, but either this one had none visible or the bloat had obscured it. Harvey wasn't going to look under his clothes. He knew the skin might slog off or burst if he applied too much pressure. Harvey pulled off the VR headset, and thankfully the goblin remained intact. He chose the visual identification option on his AR and let it run its course. Meanwhile, a priority system-wide alert popped up. An EIC analyst had gone missing, disappeared from their surveillance grid. The analyst must have lost their tracker somehow. The coalition kept tabs of their employees more intently than their enemies, and every EIC employee had a tracking implant, including himself. They said it was for their own safety, but Harvey knew it was for making sure they didn't step out of line. As a CSD investigator and Canid handler, he had far more leeway than most as long as he could explain himself. Just as Gerald was his hound, he was a dog of the EIC. Harvey made a few more requests. First to the body baggers to collect this steaming pile of goblin remains, and then requests for the analysts to find connections between the different victims, and also if they had anything to do with the missing EIC employee. For good measure, he also wanted to know the last known location of the missing employee. It might have nothing to do with his current case, but his gut instincts were telling him otherwise. The identification on the goblin came back with a loud ping. Mr. Screw Tinkerer. Damn goblins. Goblins made up their last names based on their profession or what they felt like at the time. Harvey knew enough of them to ignore the last name and concentrated on the first name, of which there could be many on the station, especially if there was an illegal egg clutch. Lowner. He memorized the first name by repeating it out loud to himself. Mr. Lown. Thank you for listening to part 4. If you would like to hear part 5 of this story, add a like and comment. Your support is greatly appreciated.